Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Excellent. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Carlos Muñiz.
No, nombre entero.
Carlos Alberto Muñiz Arias. My initials are Cama, which, as you know, means bed in Spanish. Congregante since 1991. And tonight, I have the distinct pleasure and honor to present on booklet number 6, titled Sin and Man, by el Dr. Ambrosio Gonzalez del Valle. And I say distinct honor and privilege because it really was. Reading the booklet, I've read it 3 times, I think now. And this booklet specifically, and that's rich, full of really rich, some rich thoughts, and I hope you enjoy them too and have the same appreciation as I do. So the topics we're going to cover tonight, the booklet's divided into 8 different topics. So the agenda is the following. We're going to talk about our worst enemy. You can guess who that is. Satan's allies, the devil's strategy, the process of sin, how Dr. Ambrosio explains that. Simple explanation of what is sin. He talks about what is moral law, the difference between mortal and venial sin, and then finally he goes through the effects of mortal sin. So our worst enemy. So all men, from the time that they are born, have a mortal enemy, which is the devil. And the devil can do what man cannot do, which is, so what man cannot do to a fellow man is to kill the life and the soul. But the devil can do that. And he can kill the life in our soul, and he can throw us into the fires of hell. An essential and eternal evil. As described as the quote that I have here from Matthew chapter 10, as Jesus said, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. But rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." So the devil is a concrete reality. Okay, he's an angel fallen into mortal sin that we must consider, that we live with, whether we like it or not. And I think he states that. It's funny, it's interesting because this is written in 1965, and it's such a reality today, right? How people don't even recognize that the devil exists. And all of this exists because of one day sin entered into the world. It was instigated by Satan. And from then on, he does not cease to influence us with his tricks. And there's a quote here from Charles Pierre Baudelaire. Quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist." Bonus points. Does anybody remember what movie? That line was from a
Musical.
famous movie.
Rosemary's Baby?
Maybe, but I'm thinking of something more modern. Have you guys ever seen The Usual Suspects? If you haven't seen the movie, watch it. It's from 1995. It's a good mystery movie. It's a good movie. In that movie, they use that line. Kaiser Soze. Bonus points, exactly. The Usual Suspects. Anyways, they use that line. The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world that he didn't exist.
Suspect.
The Usual Suspects. So, all of the powers of Satan's angelic nature, so Satan's angelic nature, intelligence, wisdom, and prayer are essentially perverted. And they specifically they're put into the service of evil and to the undoing of man. And here is a quote that from the first letter of Peter, chapter 5. "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him." So we recognize who our worst enemy is the devil. So who are Satan's allies? Section 2. He's got 2, according to Dr. Ambrosio, he's got 2 allies. One is the world. The world being all the people, the things, and the institutions, all the customs that are directly or indirectly in the service of sin. And this materialistic and atheistic world that constantly, influences us to rebel against Christ and against the church. Again, truer words from so many years ago that apply totally to today. And then what's the other Satan's ally? The flesh, right? We can escape the world, but we can never be removed from our bodies. It is our body with all the forces of animal nature and its passions that are in constant rebellion against reason. So the world and the flesh. So let's go back to the world. So instead of bearing Christ in the world, what we bear is the seedbed of sin. So we speak of everything that in some way distances man from God and facilitates a life of sin. And what happens is, and this is so true today, we become accustomed to seeing sin as something that is common, and it's a natural thing. And you can go beyond that. It almost like we glorify it. That's the world. The flesh, he brings up an interesting point. He says, passions are like messengers that Satan uses us to convince us that sin is good. So what does Satan do? He tricks the mind, right? He confuses the will. And so, and another point that he makes is really interesting. Passions, by their very nature, are neither good or bad. It really depends on the end that we pursue with them. So true. So here's a quote from Dr. Ambrosio del Valle on the world. He says, quote, "When a Christian is so accustomed to sin that he is not shocked or injured, it is a signal that his moral and religious defenses are already infiltrated and in danger." And from St. Paul to his letter to the Galatians, he said this thing about flesh. He says, "For the flesh desires what is contrary to the spirit, and the spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." All right, so those are Satan allies, the world and the flesh. Now let's talk about what's the strategy that the devil uses. So since man was created, the devil has a singular plan, which is to make man the personal enemy of God. And how does he do this? By leading us to mortal sin. And he does this by preparing man physically and psychologically to fall into sin all on his own. And so he develops this plan along three general lines. So how does he do it? He does it like this. First, of course, he tries to distance us from God. Second, he spiritually disarms us. And third, he attacks us at the weakest point. Does that sound familiar? Attack us at the weakest point. We learned in spiritual exercises.
Sounds like warfare.
Exactly. So part of his strategy is that he knows he cannot obligate us or force us to sin, because he cannot enter into what Dr. Ambrosio calls the sanctuary that is our liberty, which only comes from God. God is the one that gives us our liberty. But God does allow us to be tested. However, our temptations will never exceed our strengths. And this comes from the letter of St. Paul, the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." So in order to win over the souls more easily, what the devil does is he's got to first conquer what? Our passions, our flesh. And then also those things around us, the world. So what surrounds us, so both the flesh and the world. And so if we fall, it's not because of the irresistibility of the temptation. Rather, it's because of our weakness. So Dr. Ambrosio makes it very simple. He says there are two paths that we can take to defend ourselves. He makes this very simple. First, prayer united with penitence. Second, separate ourselves spiritually from the world. And this last statement here is something it really hit me. It's really profound. Without the aid of grace, there is no man or saint who can last very long on the path of virtue. No, go ahead. You want to ask a question? Or?
The second one, separate yourself spiritually from the world.
Yeah, I think what he's saying there is don't be part of the world. Have your relationship with God.
More like the masses.
Yeah, have your relationship with God, God, and separate from the world. Yeah, because it sounded a little bit funny.
Because it separates spiritually, like then.
Right, you're still in the world, but you're separating yourself, having your own separate relationship.
Do you want questions now or did?
No, go ahead if you have any comments.
Nowadays, there is so little emphasis in penitence compared to our time when we were younger, that there is like an avoidance completely by everybody. I mean, everybody says it's enough what we have to put up with in the world today to add anything to it. And it's a philosophy that has permeated the Catholic Church and some of the priests and ourselves, So, I mean, I'm just bringing that because it's interesting that this is coming up. There's been lately a little bit of emphasis with fasting and things like that because it has become popular in order to, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that we have to do some of that. I mean, sometimes it's fasting, sometimes it's, taking away things from each one of us,
Yeah, and in fact, he talks a little bit that later on. Kind of. So no, it's okay. It's good. It's all good. It's very aligned.
I think there's even...
Turn on.
I think, Sergio, to your point, I think there's very little emphasis on sin, let alone penitence.
Right.
So many people, young people nowadays mention the word sin. It's like, what are you talking about? What is sin? I didn't do anything wrong, So it's even more basic, I think. So it's good to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And so continuing with the devil's strategy. The devil is, as Dr. Ambrosio calls him, the father of lies. All his persuasive effort lies solely in the capacity to deceive. But as soon as the devil is discovered in this deceiving, he is forced to retreat. As soon as he is discovered. But as Dr. Ambrosio says, his masks are never ending. He adapts to all circumstances, and he's just waiting for the moment. So what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 26, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. Truly, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Very appropriate, the masks.
Yeah, right? Again, I mean, incredible.
Now you don't know who the devil is.
That's a good point.
We're all wearing masks.
I didn't even think about that. You're right. So now he goes through what's the process of sin, the process of how we sin. So how does a soul who lives in grace, by grace, fall with the difficulty into mortal sin? And so he says it generally follows, a process of small stumbles and concessions. And so he talks about 4 different steps. Again, it's just kind of putting a framework on this. So first, the offense of spiritual sloth, right? You distance yourself from God, you distance yourself from prayer. The devil may influence, but quite honestly, it's your responsibility and fault. You're just not being diligent on that. Then comes the offense of cooperation with good inspirations. So God begins to stir your conscience, but you know what? Your soul does not respond to that call, or what he calls the spirit voice. Then, you maliciously consent to venial sin. Yeah, you take that next step, right? Man lends himself to start offending God, but hey, it's not that serious, right? So I'm not going to get in too much trouble. It's not going to be too serious. But the defenses of your soul begin to crack with the devil's tricks, which finally comes to you deliberately consent to that mortal sin, to that grave sin. You're now spiritually disarmed. You're now distant from God. You're in a state of moral deprivation. And the soul now remains at the mercy of Satan. Pretty strong words, but quite true. So what is the counter tactic for overcoming sin? Again, just putting a simple framework that he puts down. 1, get as close to God as possible. And this is something that Sergio was kind of saying. Frequent confession, communion, daily prayer. We need to strengthen ourselves spiritually. Spiritual exercises, guidance, mortification of the body, controlling our senses. Maybe it's a reading of formative books. He also put some other examples in there. And finally, we need to constantly watch over ourselves, over our weak points, those personal examinations. Discipline in keeping one's body and one's soul in those aesthetic training. Sounds very familiar, right? The examine. So some other practical rules to know when we are walking in that spiritual life. I thought this first point I found it really interesting. Everything that slows you, blocks you, or hinders your advance towards closeness with God are the plans of the devil. Now, for some of us, we remember what Father Llorente used to tell us, right? If you're working on something and it is just like you're just facing all these obstacles and all these difficulties, you know you're doing the will of God. He always would say that. You're in the right camino. You're in the right road. This is the right path because you're facing these obstacles. But not all bumps, obstacles, and disturbances that our spiritual life presents are always from the devil. In fact, a lot of them come from ourselves. So you guys got to be wary about that. But Satan knows very well how to accommodate the condition and moment of every person, right? He knows how to try to lead the soul to spiritual cooling. Okay, so we've gone through 4 sections. The next section, he talks simply about what is sin. And he puts a very interesting terms. In essence, every sin is a rebellion against God. It is an act of arrogance. Strong words. The non-servium of Lucifer, the I will not serve, repeated over and over again by man. It is a total disrespect of God's authority as our Father and Creator. And if you think of it rationally, he's right. Sin is an absurdity, right? Why would you prefer the satisfaction of a fleeting pleasure versus the total and the eternal happiness that you get from heaven? And as he says, furthermore, sin is morally a perversion. We let ourselves be like animals instead of a rational being which is destined to achieve higher spiritual things. Also true. Then he explains a little bit about moral law. And this is because it's going to then talk about the mortal and venial sin. Moral law, or natural law as he describes it, is that set of laws that govern the free acts of man in the order of eternal life. And we all bear this, and it's imprinted into our souls because we have a natural inclination toward good. But moral law, as we know, is not always manifested to man in a very clear and absolute way. So we, as man, have a serious obligation to figure it out through reason, as to discover and define the moral law. And again, it's something that we're doing in society today, right? They're redefining moral law. They're defining what moral law is. And so sin is nothing more than a definitive transgression of moral law out of malevolent intention. But it is also a problem of conscience. Then he goes through the difference between mortal and venial sin. And basically, as you know, it's based on the severity of the sin. Theologic is divided into both. Mortal being that the transgression is more grave, right? The transgression of the moral law is more of a grave matter. It's committed in full awareness and in full consent. Versus venial, the transgression is more of a mild matter or without the subjective conditions necessary for mortal sin. Basically, that matter, how serious it is depending on the malice of the act or how much harm you're causing by it causes others. So with mortal sin, he kind of goes into more what mortal sin is. As the name indicates, it kills the life of the soul. It takes the sanctifying grace away from us. And so from the moment, and this statement was pretty bold, from the moment we're committing mortal sin, we go from being adopted children of God to adopted children of Satan. That's strong words, but think about it. I mean, the two standards, right? Who are you with? If you're not with one, then you're with the other. So that monstrosity that mortal sin produces is obviously the most terrible and damaging consequences which can occur in your soul. And because of the severity and malice, the way we can erase mortal sin is by why? By a perfect act of love for God. This means a perfect contrition through the sacrament of penance, for example, with the pain, feeling the pain that you, at least out of the fear of condemnation. So, through confession. Now, the last part of this is he just goes through like 7 different effects of mortal sin. And I'm just going to go and describe them, lightly, because I mean, there's a lot of material in what we've covered. But believe it or not, there's a lot more in there. I'm just trying to pick some of the highlights. But I thought this was really important. So, and it kind of gives a good summary of mortal sin. First, the primordial and immediate effect of mortal sin is to kill that supernatural life in the soul. In other words, we're totally empty of it, totally empty of God in our soul. And so, from that moment on, when we commit mortal sin, the soul no longer has any part with God. All the soul is filled with sin, and it's in possession of Satan. What is another effect of mortal sin? It makes us in the image and likeness of the devil, who is a pure spirit in mortal sin. By sin, Dr. Ambrosio says, we get satanized. We satanize ourselves and really become one with the devil. We're in the wrong team. We're playing for the wrong team. Another effect, we become enemies of God. As long as man does not take away that sin from his soul, we cannot be part of God. We cannot be part of him. We're apart. And so on Judgment Day, if we're in mortal sin, he will have to say, "Be gone from me, you cursed, go to the eternal fire. You are not part of my house." So, without sanctifying grace, all our virtual acts, all our prayers, our works of charity, our sacrifices produce no merit. Because as long as we're in mortal sin, nothing that man does is worthy of heaven. Another effect of mortal sin is our soul cannot leave the state of mortal sin on its own efforts. In other words, it's by the merits of Christ, right? That what he calls the moral miracle can occur in our soul. And he very interesting. He compares it to the prodigal son. The prodigal son, when the father was waiting for the son to come back, right? He's waiting there. He's anticipating the moment when his son is gonna come back one day. God does the same thing with our repentance. He sends us, by sending to us the necessary grace, so that we are able to reconcile with him. Just like the prodigal son, he anticipates us.
Does he, in the booklet, define mortal sin and venial sin and the difference between the two?
Yeah, that was the slide I covered before.
That was in the case.
Yes, he does. So mortal sin makes us, I don't know, strong words, instruments of the devil. In that we serve, because we serve now as a means of spreading sin. Why? Because sin tends to expand and infect others. And we know this. We know this from our personal. So after a short time, it corrupts everything that comes into contact with it. Because it is easier to lead man into sin than it is to virtue. And finally, the last effect of mortal sin is interesting. He says when the soul is weakened in such a way that it requires a long period of convalescence. In other words, to fully repair the damage that the sin has produced. And so this vestige of sin, as he calls it, is the predisposition where the soul is left so weak that basically it can fall back into any temptation. And I thought about this, and I go, I remember when Father Llorente, again, in the exercises would talk about like the post, the wooden post, and then the nail you put the nail onto the post, and then when you remove the nail, you no longer have that, but you see the mark of it. But sin was very similar to that. You still you're forgiven, your sins are forgiven, but you still have that mark. That's kind of what I hear. Same thing. If you're in mortal sin for such a long time, it really takes some time to get to a condition where you can no longer sin.
Carlos, I like the language a lot, but I want to cut that last thing. Sometimes I often hear people say in overhearing conversations, or I get asked, when you're forgiven for a sin, you're forgiven once and you're done, right? You don't need to go to the priest continually asking for forgiveness for a sin. If you're a contrite, if it's a sincere confession, you're contrite and you're repentant. But what I think people fail to understand, and sometimes I'm at a loss of words, is to explain exactly that.
Yeah.
Right? Your sin is gone. God no longer sees that sin. You're forgiven. It's over. It's over, right? But it's not like your past is erased. It's not like all of a sudden you have a new narrative of life or a new history. Like, I don't know what is the difference between saying in heaven your sin is gone, like in God's eyes your sin is gone, but the vestige of sin in this time
So you know what?
is still there.
So you know what a good example is? I just thought about this where we were talking, and I know this because I've acted like Peter in several plays. People that know me. Peter is a good example. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and then when Jesus came, when Jesus asked him, Peter, do you love me? And the 3rd time, Peter all of a sudden remembers, like, oh, you remember back, hey, I denied you 3 times. In other words, it never leaves you in that sense. I mean, you were forgiven. No, you're totally forgiven. But I think naturally, as human beings, it's hard to lift that burden, the full burden of it, right? Of the sin.
Carlos, in regards to everything that Dr. Ambrosio said there, it reminds me also what Congregante said, that your mortal sin has consequences in the entire community. Sometimes in a lot of people. And some of those bullet points really verify this. So when you go for forgiveness, you need to kind of think about who has been affected by your sin, and try to go and repair that if you can, with whatever you can do, because obviously there have been people that have been affected by your state of sin.
You must have been listening to the conversation that Jose and I were having earlier.
Oh, probably.
Because
I wasn't.
that applies really well.
But that is a very important point.
Yeah, it is.
The mortal sin is not only affecting you, but perhaps the entire group of people that you have influence over.
Absolutely.
Isn't the layman's saying, I forgive, but don't forget, part of it? We humans tend to hold on to the memory of something that hurt us. By nature, we try to avoid it.
Right.
And the bridging into a relationship with someone that hurt you once takes a lot more effort than someone that has not hurt you.
Yeah. But to be similar, to be like God does, you do forgive and forget, right? That He doesn't remember these things.
I think we have to differentiate between the effect of mortal sin on the rest of the world and the relationship we have with God. I mean, God forgives completely our sins. The first time that we're sorry, they're gone. But the effects of the mortal sin stay in the world. For example, if you say something about somebody's reputation, even if you take it back, even if you say I'm sorry, even if you say I was misleading you, I was joking, that stays forever. And I think that's why sometimes we have a hard time forgiving ourselves, because we remember the impact that we had in the comments that we have that day. So I think there's a difference. And I think, for example, at least sometimes I say, God, why God? Because Adam and Eve committed a sin. Why would we have to pay for it? In reality, we pay for it because we commit the same sins all the time. We're thinking that we're better than God, But I think there's a difference between the forgiveness by God and the impact that we have staying with our human nature and the people around us. I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
A couple of things came up in mind, and one of the things is that we, you know, when you grow from something that happened, you grow from sin. I've always thought that when I go to confession, and God, I know that God forgave that sin that I did when I was in my 20s, but that stays there so that I make sure that I don't sin like that again. And I know that God forgave me and I'm okay for that, but in my mind it's like, okay, well, remember what you did and remember how you grew from there and remember where it's taking you now. And that's I think one of the things that I think that when we talk about is that, yeah, that hole, I mean, I've used that analogy when I talk to kids a lot, is that hole, that nail, you know, no matter how many times you cover it, no matter how many times you try to put wood putty or something, the color's always going to be there.
Yeah.
You're always going to know not to hit the nail that way again. You know, and when you're you know, and that's how I've always taken it. The other thing I was going to ask you, and I kind of want to go backwards, is what did he talk about actually sinning? Did he talk about that it's human nature? Did he talk about that we're going to do it? Like, because we talk about sin, and he talks a lot about that life that you have to live, but does he emphasize the fact that you know, you're going to fall?
Oh yeah.
But know what the consequences are. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, he does, and it goes really deep in. He goes in deep into that. I mean, I kind of gave like a summary kind of point, but yeah, he goes deep into it. And he goes like, hey, this is here's how you're gonna go. You know, it's gonna go like this. You're gonna go down like that. And he goes and basically the different steps of that. Yeah, he goes deep into that.
There are two subtle points, and I want sort of touch on one of them.
Yeah, there are two subtle points, although I want to touch on one of them. I hold to, and I hope it's good theology, but one is just, it's kind of a pretty thing, is that God doesn't just forgive, God does forget. God has the ability to forget it. We don't, but he does. So that is like it never happened to him. On the other hand, as Ramon said, there are some things you can't take back. And you have to do the best you can. But there are some things you can't. If you kill somebody's son or daughter, you can't take that back. There's nothing you can do. And that's, I believe, and that's what purgatory is for. We have to, even though we've been forgiven for the sins, you still have to make up for the things that you couldn't give up. You couldn't give them back. It's impossible. So that's what you make up for in purgatory. I think that's a fine point there.
Willie?
Yeah, one of these things, just to see if you went into mercy, so like the doctrine of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, right? Or you take Saint Maria Goretti. She was killed by Alessandro. He goes to jail. His canonization is now up for him to become a saint. Right? He didn't get her life back. So he committed this horrific mortal sin. He obviously did his own penance and everything else, but he couldn't bring her life back. But God, otherwise, the despair of sin, right, and the impacts of that is another work of the devil. So the sin on top of sin, where the discouragement, right, is not from God. That's the devil on top of what happened. God is encouraging us to say, I've got this, like the good thief. You know, I've got this. And through mercy, which is why we had the year of mercy and all that, it's hard for us to conceive mercy. In a way, that might be the hardest mystery to understand, because it's not that original justice we're so used to understanding, or the merit, that by merit we have to equal or make up for what we did, which is why the doctrine of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, as we're taught it, is so profound, because it's the little way, you know, and it's, wait a second, there's another level that goes beyond justice, that goes beyond merit, which is God's mercy. It is that deep. And our job is to really give of ourselves, even in sin, that true trust that we've been forgiven because of the cross. The cross is that powerful. God, it took all that, even as injustice as it is, and we can't make up for it. God allowed that ability to make it a greater good, even in us. And so I just was wondering whether any of that mercy, or how that he explained that in all of this. Because all of this is the equal for the equal, the plus, the minus,
But that's not God. God is greater than that. That merciful love, how does that play into all of that which the world is missing on?
No, that's not, he doesn't mention mercy. He does not mention mercy at all.
It's probably another book.
It's the other, yeah, it's the book, it's the unwritten booklet. But good point, Willie, good point.
Reality, to expand on Willie's point, when we deal with in the detention ministry, with the prisoners and people that have been there, and it is our mission to a certain degree to try to make them feel that as a forgiven sinner. It's very difficult for some people to get to that level where you feel that you are a forgiven sinner because of the mercy of God, that the justice of the Lord, the justice of man is punishment, is jail, is torture, but the justice of the Lord is mercy. And that is something that it's the most difficult thing for someone who has gotten to the level you were talking about, murder or taking.
And then just as an aside note, again, because I do the Passion Play in St. Louis, one of the roles is Demas, the good thief, who on the cross, Jesus says, you'll be in heaven with me.
The first saint.
Yeah, he was right there. He was given the mercy and the salvation at the cross.
And while God never withholds his mercy, only the contrite sinner is open to receiving it.
Correct.
I think that's one of the big issues we have sometimes, and that's one of the issues of the messages of sin. Like, do you understand the depth of your sin and the break with God that sin causes? Not only the break with God, but also, you brought this up, many of us talk about the break with community. Even, for instance, in a marriage, when there's infidelity in a marriage, this is not the cheating spouse goes to the priest, says, hey, forgive my sin. Priest says you're absolved. Goes to the husband, say, forgive my sin. Next day, it's marriage. I say, oh, it was never an affair. It doesn't happen that way.
Right.
There's a period of recovery and a period of regaining the trust and a period of saying, like, understanding each other again. I think, so there has to, that mercy is always available. But there has to be a depth of that contrite heart. It's hard, and I think Ramon was saying, to get to understand the depth of that mercy, you have to understand the depth of your sin. And the two go hand in hand. You can't just willy-nilly say, oh, forgive me, oh, God's all merciful. You have to understand what this, I think, that's why I love the powerful language that you mentioned here.
Yeah.
We've lost that, the truth of that powerful language. That the adopted sons of Satan, like, that's really powerful stuff, but it's true. Sin is not just, just erase it and clean it up with a Mr. Clean's match eraser. It's all done, right? It's way worse than that. It's pretty serious stuff.
But in society right now, sin is just a blemish on Instagram. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, this person did this, and you forget it 2 days later because there's somebody else's post and there's somebody else's. So the world is like saying, well, there's no depth to sin anymore.
Yeah.
There's no, like, it's all venial. There's no, you can literally bash someone publicly and mention, and tomorrow something else is, and that's forgotten. And it's okay to, and nobody forgets. So that's why one of the things that we were talking about is like, we as Catholic men, like, hey, why we get better is, I think, is that we build on the fact that, hey, I messed up. And I know what I messed up. And that's why I'm moving up, and that's my sin, because that's why I asked you a question. What does he talk about being human and sinning? Because we're not perfect men, and we sin. So at one point in time, like how do we learn from that sin? God's given me the grace to have the ability to fail, to be able to build myself up. And he's given me the ability to confess and give me the grace of complete forgiveness. Because, hey, wait, you need to mess up, because you're not going to be a better man if you don't understand what's right or what's wrong.
Right, but you have to be also open to that grace.
Correct.
And then that's why the sacraments come in, where you receive the grace in the different sacraments and all that. I mean, that's being open, right? And same with the mercy. You got to be open to receiving it. Otherwise, then God can send all he wants. But if you're not asking for it, and ready and have fertile ground to receive it, the effect's going to be minimal. So, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Great discussion.